You know, when I first started this channel, I always knew there would come a time when certain parts of the Zelda fandom would rub up against me in a way I would consider to be bad faith. The entire r/Zelda subreddit was an early example of that for me, and a recent issue I've had to contend with is Twitter users. These people are full-time amateur complainers, in contrast to myself, a full-time professional complainer. I'm all for critiquing the Zelda series, don't get me wrong, but something I learned recently is that there's a decent contingent of Zelda fans who genuinely hate parts of the Zelda series not because they're poorly designed or badly made, but because they've convinced themselves that they are somehow morally or politically problematic. This video isn't for those people, because they've doubtless already made up their minds and likely aren't willing to listen to reason at this point. What I want to do today is to tackle a particular topic that was brought to my attention recently that I personally take issue with, because it relates to the storytelling of my favorite game in the entire Zelda series, Ocarina of Time. That particular topic is the Gerudo. For those of you who don't know, the Gerudo are a fantasy race from the Legend of Zelda series comprised of dark-skinned, red-haired, often beautiful women who only give birth to a single man once every 100 years. This man, by law and tradition, is made their king, and the current person occupying that role would be Ganondorf, the series' main villain. They live in the drylands west of the Great Canyon dividing Hyrule from the Gerudo Kingdom, but they often travel into Hylian lands in order to steal high-value goods like horses and men. Yes, men. Because these women only give birth to a single man once every 100 years, the only way they can continue to reproduce in the interim is by taking men from other tribes, in this case the Hylians, and using them to, well, you know. Oftentimes, this activity is achieved through seduction and thus completely consensual, because actually capturing men can be quite difficult when your race is made up entirely of small, beautiful women. So there's both a combination of direct banditry and feminine wild that they utilize to survive. And yes, I do say survive, because the lands they come from are so barren and inhospitable that their theft is, in fact, done out of necessity in most cases. Ocarina of Time makes that rather clear. Still, Hylians tend to negatively stigmatize the Gerudo for their constant thievery, to the point where one might even go so far as to call it a kind of fantasy racism, though obviously it is born out of some understandable degree of caution in this case. Now, I love the Gerudo. In fact, a lot of people do. In my case, I love them because of the storytelling and world-building implications they add to the setting of Hyrule, with characters like Naboru and even Ganondorf himself providing unique and interesting perspectives on Hylian society from the point of view of an outsider, one who came from a land possessing none of the blessings of Hyrule's perfectly temperate geography. Others see them as icons of representation and diversity, and ones which don't break the immersion of Hyrule's world building either, giving the fandom plenty of positive women of color models to look up to like Naboru, Urbosa, and Riju. Either way, they're often hailed as inseparable additions to the world building of Hyrule, adding depth and representation to a well-beloved series. So color me surprised when I learned that certain parts of the fandom not only don't like the Gerudo, but actively campaign for the removal or complete retcon of their culture and storytelling. The reason, as I was told, is that the Gerudo are, quote, Orientalist. Now, there's a bit more to this opposing argument than just that one singular term, but it's important that we understand what that word means and how it's applied to the Gerudo before going any further. Orientalism is an often disputed term, so I'm going to give you the simple, and I think rather nuanced definition provided by Britannica just to start us off. Orientalism, a Western scholarly discipline of the 18th and 19th centuries that encompassed the study of the languages, literatures, religions, philosophies, histories, art, and laws of Asian societies, especially ancient ones. As Britannica puts it, this discipline still exists. It's simply been rebranded as Asian Studies, or if you're trying to be more specific, since Asia's a big place, Middle Eastern, Indian, Chinese, or other such studies. Okay, sounds pretty innocuous, right? So what's the problem here? The problem is that in the modern day, the term has been commandeered to specifically refer to depictions of Eastern cultures which are considered by some to be problematic. As Britannica points out, it was the work of Professor Edward Said with his book Orientalism, published in 1978, that began to shift this perspective. And given that Said himself was an American immigrant from Palestine, his work obviously centered around Middle Eastern culture specifically. Thus, despite the term Orientalism having broadly referred to Asia as a whole, and even India specifically at times for the British, the way many Americans understand the term nowadays is as thus: the problematic and or racist depiction of Islamic and Arabic culture in media. So when some people say that the Gerudo are Orientalist, What they're really saying is that they think the Gerudo are negative or racist depictions of Middle Eastern peoples, and thus advocate for their removal from the series. I cannot disagree with this perspective anymore if I tried. It's so blaringly surface level in its analysis of the purpose and role of the Gerudo within the Zelda series that it frustrates me just thinking about it. Honestly though, I wouldn't be making this video if it were just a few Twitter freaks who had this perspective. It's specifically because I was told all this by another larger Zelda creator, who I will not name because I don't want to send any harassment their way, that I realized that this faulty perspective was a lot more widespread than first thought, and looking into online discussions on the matter only proved that much. So that's why I'm making this video. I want to actually engage with the other side on this issue and argue, from my perspective, why the Gerudo are important and positive additions to the Zelda series, and why this accusation of them being Orientalist is ultimately surface level and not a convincing argument as to why they should be removed or retconned from the series. I think the first question we need to answer at this junction is, are the Gerudo even supposed to be representations of Middle Eastern people? After all, if the answer were no, then it would kind of kill this whole argument in its crib, so let's start there. The Gerudo are clearly different from real-world Islamic cultures in several ways, the first of which is that they're an inherently matriarchal society, even in spite of their male king, because the consequences of their biology dictate it so. They look down heavily on men, believing them to be useless for anything other than breeding. This, obviously, is in complete contrast to the general patriarchal family structures of real-world Middle Eastern peoples. There are also no parallels to the Islamic religion, a very big omission if the intent was to make them an allegory for such people, with even the singular track of the game's OST that utilized an Islamic prayer being associated with the Gorons, not the Gerudo. If the developers were hell-bent on associating the Gerudo with Middle Easterners specifically, then it's strange that this rather blatant parallel was associated with a completely different race. So those are some of the differences, but how about the similarities? Well, first off, yes, these women live out in the desert, so that could easily be associated with the climate of insular Arabia. Yes, their harem pants rightly associate them with the stereotypical dress of Muslim women, and the skin they show around their midriff is reminiscent of Egyptian provocative dancers of the 19th century. They also have dark tan skin and large noses, which are phenotypes often associated with Semitic peoples, but the bright red hair is definitely a distinguishing feature that throws that comparison off a bit. And honestly, depending on which games you're talking about, their skin is more orange than it is brown, which doesn't really match up with any real-world ethnic groups at all. Additionally, Ganondorf himself doesn't look anything like a Middle Easterner, Arabic or otherwise, with green skin, no facial hair, and armor that looks completely made up and fantastical as opposed to any sort of real-world parallel to Arabic armor. That being said, a few of the Gerudo's more advanced warriors utilize scimitars in combat, which are traditional pan-Arabic, even pan-Islamic swords, though it should be noted that the vast majority of Gerudo guards use glaives, which are not exclusively Middle Eastern, and the Iron Knuckles, who are just brainwashed Gerudos in suits of armor, utilize battle axes in combat, which are anything but Middle Eastern. Alright, so what's the conclusion we can draw here? Well, it's clear that the Gerudo are absolutely not simple stand-ins for Arabs, Persians, or any other kind of Middle Eastern people, because the fundamental differences in their biology, society, and customs are too different to ignore. That being said, some pretty major similarities are definitely there as well, and them being pitted as an oppositional other to the Hylians at times, who are absolutely inspired by European cultures, cannot be ignored either. Ultimately, my conclusion would be that the Gerudo, like the Red Guards from the Elder Scrolls series or the Ishvalans from Fullmetal Alchemist, definitely take real-world inspiration from Middle Eastern cultural elements, while ultimately creating a unique and completely different fantasy race in the process, which is honestly the same thing you could say about the Hylians, who are based on Germans, or the Sheikah, who, in the Breath of the Wild era games anyway, are based on Japanese people. So, okay, what's the problem here? Pretty much every fantasy series in existence takes real-world cultures and molds them into made-up races and societies in order to create interesting and fleshed-out fictional worlds. So what's wrong with the Gerudo in particular? This is where the term Orientalism comes back into play. Apparently, the Gerudo are problematic because their culture is based off of perceivably exaggerated and stereotypical elements of Middle Eastern society, and thus, according to these people, that makes the Gerudo inherently racist. Now, in all fairness, this is a subjective conclusion to come to. Plenty of unreasonable people will shout racism at the most innocuous depictions of human beings, and there's little I can do to convince these people otherwise. But what I can do is engage with the very logic being used to criticize the Gerudo and tear it apart to the best of my abilities, in such a way that reasonable heads will prevail by the end of things. We should start our analysis by dissecting the very concept which is being used as the crux of the opposition's argument: Orientalism. I already explained briefly what Orientalism objectively is, but it should be noted that there's a much more precise definition which these people are using when they're applying applying it in the context of media representations of Middle Eastern culture, or even fictional depictions utilizing aspects of Middle Eastern culture, as in this case. Professor Said himself points this out in his definitive work on the subject, claiming that Orientalism has many separate yet equally important and valid definitions. I should preface that Said was actually quite the respected scholar in his time, and, having read much of his work myself, I highly respect his writing style, argumentation, and even his views to a degree, even if I disagree with him at several points. Ultimately, though, the definition he was interested in, and thus the one used by those who derive their views from his work, is as thus. Quote, Orientalism is not a mere political subject matter or field that is reflected passively by culture, scholarship, or institutions, nor is it a large and diffuse collections of texts about the Orient, nor is it representative and expressive of some nefarious Western imperialist plot to hold down the Oriental world. It is rather a distribution of geopolitical awareness into aesthetic, scholarly, economic, sociological, historical, and philosophical texts. It is an elaboration not only of a basic geographical distinction, but also of a whole series of interests which it not only creates, but also maintains. It is, rather than expresses, a certain will or intention to understand, in some cases to control, manipulate, even to incorporate, what is a manifestly different, or alternative and novel, world. To simplify, Said believed that European art, culture, and studies related to the Orient, whether scholarly and factual, or perverse and stereotypical, ultimately helped to maintain an image of otherness regarding Near East cultures and people, thus propagating the colonial system and imperial ambitions of both France and Britain. In other words, intent mattered very little to Said, because in many cases, Oriental studies were both informative and respectful. Said himself lists several key examples, such as Edward William Lane's account of the manners and customs of the modern Egyptians. But because the summation of all these works existed within the context of colonial domination over the Near East, and oftentimes were used to justify said domination, the ultimate purpose and end goal of Oriental studies was, in Said's conclusion, a way to stigmatize, otherize, and dominate the Near East from a Western perspective. Alright, so with all of that out of the way, there's now an obvious question we need to ask ourselves at this point. What the fuck does any of that have to do with a fantasy video game made by Japanese people in the year 1998? It's not that Orientalism or colonial stereotypes are impossible for Japanese people to participate in. See Kimba the White Lion and all of its blatant racism against both Africans and Middle Easterners is a prime example, but how does that have anything to do with the Gerudo? The idea seems to be that because the Gerudo have aspects of their culture dictated by Middle Eastern elements, and because said culture stands in contrast to Hylian society, that it is therefore Orientalist. But Orientalism doesn't automatically equal bad. Like I said, modern Middle Eastern studies are literally just Orientalism with some rebranding attached to it. One of my main contentions with Said's work is that he includes good faith scholasticism, which he himself acknowledges the existence of, within the wider context of Orientalism. In other words, under Said's definition, it's impossible as a Western scholar, artist, writer, or whatever have you, to produce any work that integrates Middle Eastern culture into its DNA in any capacity without it then being considered Orientalist, and thus, as these people will tell you, racist. Therefore, how does one distinguish genuine scholarly or artistic interest from blatant racism or bigotry? These are the reasons I personally remain unconvinced by many of Said and his followers' arguments, even if he provides some pretty brilliant analysis at times, because it essentially disallows anyone from taking an interest in Middle Eastern culture, philosophy, or history without then being labeled as an Orientalist, and thus a participant in colonial domination. So whether or not the Gerudo are or aren't Orientalist almost doesn't even matter at this point. So let's completely abandon the opposition's Orientalist labeling. It clearly isn't helpful. The real question we should be asking is this: are the Gerudo a negative stereotype meant to characterize Middle Eastern peoples in a bad light? The answer, I would posit, is an emphatic no. True, the Gerudo live in a society which values skills in thievery above all. This is undeniably a fact, and one could, on a surface level, say that this is an evil trait. But is this obsession with thievery something endemic to the Gerudo race? Or is it perhaps more environmentally determined? See, the Gerudo live out in a barren desert where absolutely nothing grows. Again, this is reminiscent of the very same geography one might find in insular Arabia. However, rather than being a mere bit of window dressing, a lazy way to communicate the otherness of the Gerudo race, this geographical reality is built into the very foundations of Gerudo society and culture. The Gerudo king Ganondorf invades the land of Hyrule not because he just feels like it, but because the land he comes from is a barren desert where nothing grows. This is said explicitly in the Wind Waker. Not even Gerudo horses are native to the desert, with most having been originally stolen from the more temperate lands of Hyrule. In other words, the Gerudo steal not because they just feel like it or because they're inherently evil, but because the barren wastes they hail from are so inhospitable that banditry is the only reasonable way by which they can make a living. Combine that with the Gerudo's need for foreign men, because of their own biological inability to produce their own, and it's clear that the thief culture of the Gerudo people arose not out of inherent evil or malice on their part, but rather a simple physiological, economic, and even reproductive need to survive. Now, that's not to say that the Gerudo are a completely noble race incapable of evil. Ganondorf himself is indeed an evil man, overcome with greed and an insatiable lust for power. But Ocarina of Time clearly distinguishes the king of the Gerudo from his people, depicting them not as willing collaborators to his invasion and occupation of Hylian lands, but rather fellow victims of his terrible rule. The only reason they tacitly follow him is because of the respect the women hold for their second-in-command, Noboru. That is, until we learn that she was kidnapped by Ganondorf's mother and put under a spell that forced her to do the King of Evil's bidding. Noboru, in reality, is horrified by Ganon's actions, thinking it highly immoral that he steals from women and children, and being completely against his plans to subjugate Hyrule. In the end, she becomes one of the Seven Sages, helping Link and co. defeat Ganondorf for good and freeing her people from his tyrannical rule. This act of heroism even seems to change the perspective Hylians have of the Gerudo, with the women of the tribe making an appearance at the big celebration the Hylian people put on at the end of the game. The hope, then, is that the victory we achieved with Noboru's help won't simply restore Hyrule to its former glory, but also foster a new relationship with the people of the Gerudo Desert. And guess what? By the time of Breath of the Wild, that's exactly what happened. 10,000 years into the future, and Gerudo culture has completely changed. The main Gerudo settlement is no longer a fortress city meant to house foreign captives and booty, but a mercantile hub of trade and commerce. The Gerudo have become exceedingly wealthy and prosperous, not through thievery or conquest, but open trade and diplomacy with Hyrule and its citizens. Thus, the Gerudo thief culture has entirely evaporated by this point in history, replaced instead with jewelers, restaurateurs, and scholars. Now, let me make something clear. I do have issues with a lot of the world building in Breath of the Wild in general, and those problems extend to the Gerudo as well, but my critiques of Breath of the Wild as a game aren't the subject of this video. What's important to note here is how the evolution of Gerudo culture over such a vast period of time proves not only that the Gerudo are not being portrayed as an inherently evil or treacherous race of people, but rather as dynamic products of their environment and society. In other words, the Gerudo are not representative of some sort of evil other, but rather just a unique group of people whose culture differs from the Hylians. And of course it does. Why would a race of exclusively women from the desert develop the same culture as a group of elves from a temperate, fertile environment? And why wouldn't the developers take key notes from real-world desert cultures when crafting their own fantasy characters? Call it Orientalist if you please, but can you actually articulate what exactly is wrong with this portrayal? Well, that's where that one Zelda YouTuber I mentioned earlier comes into the picture again, because they did just that. Their response was, and I quote, "Making your Middle Eastern coded characters an entire tribe of midriff-bearing thieves who fight with scimitars is indeed racist." Okay, that's definitely an interesting way to frame things, but is that really an accurate summation of the Gerudo? First off, the midriff thing is absolutely intentional. Yes, the Gerudo sexualize themselves on purpose, because they're trying to attract men from other tribes. That's literally what the survival of their entire species is predicated on. And that detail is necessary to Ocarina of Time's story, because the Gerudo part of that game is meant to explore Link's developing sexuality as he grows into adulthood. Don't ask, it's a long fucking story. Watch my Ocarina of Time review if you want the full details on that. You may not like it. You might be a prude who doesn't want to see any level of human sexuality in your video games, and you're free to feel that way, but do not pretend like it's without purpose. It very clearly has a reason for being there. And besides, the men in Gerudo society, at least in Breath of the Wild anyway, show off their midriff too, as seen by the Vo armor set and Ganondorf himself. And this seems to be more of a quick way to convey the harsh weather of the Gerudo Desert to the player, rather than a direct parallel to Middle Eastern dress patterns in general, given that men and women in the Middle East famously do not show off this much skin. As for the second part of this argument, the scimitar is a Middle Eastern sword. Yes! How did you know that? It's absolutely ubiquitous throughout Islamic military history, and is essentially the equivalent of a European arming sword. Is it racist to have Link, clearly a white man, wielding a cross-guarded straight sword? Or for the Yiga, a Japanese-coded tribe of villains, to wield katanas? A fucking course not. So why is it an issue for Middle Eastern-coded characters to use real-world Middle Eastern weapons? Not that this is even an accurate statement in the first place. Most Gerudo don't wield scimitars. They use spears, because that's what common foot soldiers of all armies use. It's only the greatest and wealthiest Gerudo warriors who carry such scimitars. So again, this isn't even an accurate criticism, much less a valid one. And that about sums up the breadth of the opposition's argument. The Gerudo are Orientalist, they're stereotypical, they're racist, etc. and what have you. Why? Because the developers took the time to ingratiate real-world Middle Eastern culture into their storytelling, while still crafting a unique and interesting fantasy race. Because they wanted to represent a group of people who weren't just Germanic elves, and they wanted to do it in a dynamic, in-universe way. And because they dared to show a society full of both heroes and villains, instead of some patronizing, overly positive portrayal that completely neglects to represent these characters as flawed human beings with plenty of good left to give to the world. And actually, let's take a moment to focus on that topic in particular, because we've been talking about the Gerudo people only as a broad group up until this point, and that's fine and dandy, but we should really take a look at some of the more prominent characters who belong to this group, because I think that's really where this whole accusation of racism begins to fall apart. I already mentioned one of these characters in passing, Noboru. She's a well-respected thief from the Gerudo tribe who sort of acts as a moral pillar for her community, initially working to keep her people from using direct violence to obtain their loot, or from victimizing women, children, or the exceedingly poor. Is she perfect? No, because she's still stealing from hardworking men, and that's not exactly moral, but it's definitely a step up from indiscriminate slaughter and banditry, which is exactly the kind of villainy that Ganondorf engages in. But his people don't just follow his lead without question, they have a moral compass, and so Noboru's open opposition to Ganondorf's exceedingly cruel and jingoistic tendencies ends up being a major thorn in his side. It's under these circumstances that Ganon has his mother Twinrova kidnap Noboru and brainwash her with their magic, enslaving her and her followers into subservient obedience as slave soldiers. This does have a Middle Eastern parallel, by the way. Gilman, Mamluks, and Janissaries were all types of slave soldiers forced into servitude by certain Islamic rulers with imperial ambitions, and it's generally seen today as one of the more immoral practices of these cultures because, say it with me, slavery is bad. Ganondorf turning his own people into slave soldiers, then, is not a condemnation of the Gerudo, but rather of their king. And vitally, it is one of the victims of this horrific practice, Noboru herself, who goes on to herald Ganon's very downfall. We free her from Twinrova's grasp, employ her help as one of the 7 sages, and watch as they seal Ganon away in the Sacred Realm. For this bravery, Noboru is hailed as a saint and venerated and highly in art and literature for centuries to come. And the Gerudo, once seen as a group of outsiders, become further ingratiated into Hylian society until finally becoming the rich, powerful city-state we see them as in Breath of the Wild. Speaking of which, the Breath of the Wild era provides us with our next 2 Gerudo icons, the first of which is Urbosa. To say that this character is absolutely beloved by the fandom is an understatement. She's strong, brave, and a fearless leader of women who serves as a mother figure to Princess Zelda. In stark contrast to Ganondorf, who embodies the absolute worst of Eastern despotism, Urbosa shows what the Gerudo are capable of when they're ruled by a just hand. Their city is clean, orderly, lawful, and prosperous, and she's such a venerated figure that rulers and soldiers hundreds of years after her death still seek to emulate her example. She's often considered a positive point of female representation in the series, and even though I personally don't really care for her all too much, I can see why so many members of the fandom hold her in such high regard. Third and finally is Riju. Similar to Urbosa, Riju is a chieftain of the Gerudo tribe serving in the interregnum between their kings. Unlike Urbosa though, Riju is exceedingly young and inexperienced. Her age isn't confirmed by the time of Tears of the Kingdom, but I think she's probably about 18 or 19 given the context clues of the game. It's hard to tell. Either way, she has little experience governing or even fighting, and is trying desperately to master the power of lightning capable of being wielded by Gerudo like Urbosa. She even emulates her fighting style, carrying 2 scimitars into battle. Tears of the Kingdom is a generally poorly written game, but the one time I felt there was an actual decent bit of writing was during Riju's quest, because her struggle to master her powers and her inadequacy when comparing herself to the other warriors in her clan was something that really humanized her, and it helps that she actually has a decent rapport with both her direct subordinates and Link. And honestly, there are whole scenes in this game where she's the only character who articulates an even decently intelligent thought, which is more a condemnation of the game's writing than it is a compliment of Riju in particular. Regardless, she's my favorite character in Tears of the Kingdom, and absolutely best girl. Fucking fight me on this, I dare you. These are positive, strong, female role models who all come from the same tribe of people, and they are beloved characters, not just because of their good writing, but also, and I admit this is less important to me, but it is important to others, which I respect, they add diversity to a game series that otherwise is centered around European-looking characters. I'm really not sure what these people envision the Zelda series looking like without its current world-building structure, but if it's anything like the fantasy slop we see on TV these days, where every cast of characters look like they came straight out of LA, then they're making a big mistake. What you have with a series like Zelda or The Elder Scrolls is a fantasy story with dynamic, proper representation. You can have women of color appear in your European-based fantasy story if you take the time to write a group of people with an interesting history and culture that fits into that world perfectly. Ocarina of Time is beautiful precisely because it represents true diversity. Different cultures, people, even species who each interact with each other, but otherwise have separate cultures and societies informed by their geographical location, biology, and history. The Gerudo are an integral part of that beautiful tapestry. They represent not an evil, characterized other, but rather a distinct, interesting group of people who add depth and realism to the wider world of Hyrule. If you want diversity and positive representation in your fantasy games, this is it. And if you're like me and you just care about good storytelling in video games, then this is also it. Because Ocarina of Time is a game about people of all walks of life. Hylian, Goron, Zora, Kokiri, Sheikah, and Gerudo all coming together to defeat a common evil. It's the exact same underlying message that the progenitor of modern fantasy, Lord of the Rings, so elegantly put to pen in the mid-20th century. A story written by a war veteran who despised tyrants and championed the beautiful tapestry of human cultures. And that is true positive representation. That is what actual diversity in a fantasy series looks like. And no amount of crying Orientalism is going to change that fact. I apologize if this video included too much mention of heavy socio-political concepts. I'm sorry, I really tried to avoid that on this channel. But seeing supposed fans of this series attack one of its core bits of world building and sources of diversity under the guise of some sort of political pseudo-intellectualist moral crusade really triggered the fuck out of me. I love Zelda games. I love consistent world building, and I love fantasy stories in particular. And I feel like the people who are grasping at straws to attack the Gerudo don't understand what they're really doing here. Not only would they seek to remove a vital part of Hyrule's world building from the canon simply to satisfy their own need to fight against self-perceived Orientalist prejudice from a group of developers who, I should remind you, are fucking Japanese, but they would also be removing a cast of characters who many Zelda fans enjoy seeing and even identify with in many cases. And if your solution to that problem is to keep the Gerudo in the series but take away all of their unique cultural identity, then what you're advocating for, ironically, is the most colonial fucking thing I can possibly imagine. Erasing a distinct cultural identity and replacing it with a base European one. Let people be different. Let them learn to overcome their biases and work together. Let there be true diversity in our fantasy stories. Erasing the parts of Gerudo culture inspired by the Middle East, I think, only makes this story less representative, not more so.